May the 8th, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. After years of struggle, a deserved celebration. Day. In 1942, the Allied military leaders talked about opening up a new front in Western Europe. They wanted to help out the Russians, who were in an enormous battle with the Nazis. Finally, in December 1943, at the Cairo Conference, General Dwight D. Eisenhower received command of Operation Overlord. This would become the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever known. He immediately instructed the gathering of large quantities of supplies for the Allied invading fleet. These were to be stored in southern England. Meanwhile, Hitler prepared for the invasion. The only thing Hitler didn't know was when it was coming and where it was going to take place. In England, General Eisenhower and his deputies charted the liberation of a lost continent. They planned when and where the mighty armies of the United Nations would strike. Today, Normandy in northern France would be that battleground. Operation Overlord would be D-Day. Into the building of their defense system, the so-called West Wall, the Nazis used their slave labor of conquered nations. Pictures made by the Germans themselves to impress their satellites with the strength and invincibility of their fortifications. Within steel and concrete emplacements, 4 years in the making, the Germans have amassed every known weapon of defense. Naval batteries and heavy artillery were housed in almost impregnable concrete bunkers. These guns could reach out to sea and engage heavily armed warships. Whether those weapons were enough to stop the Allied onslaught would only be proven in the future. Because Hitler didn't know exactly where the Allies would strike, he had to place heavy armies all along the coast in sometimes very quiet areas. On the beaches themselves were set up barbed wire fences, minefields, and anti-tank ditches and ramps. Behind the Atlantic Wall were 4 armored divisions of Panzer Group West. On the other side of the Channel, England, an armed camp bristling with armed tanks and trucks and guns from the United States and Canada. Here is the fruition of 4 years of planning and production. This is a glimpse of England as the Allied armies awaited D-Day. Locomotives built to run on continental railways. Freight cars and tank cars that will replace rolling stock that was destroyed by the Germans. All this and more is included in the gigantic preparation for the invasion. D-Day. Also gathered is the enormous Navy Armada, assembled to transport the Allied armies across the English Channel. Here is something of the ingenuity of the Allied engineers. Assault boats and invasion barges launched directly from the decks of the ships that brought them to England. Week after week, the fleet grew in numbers. Steel ships of every description. Ships that were especially designed and constructed for the mission upon which they were soon to embark.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away.
Nothing was left to chance. Every loading operation was rehearsed and timed in advance. Every soldier knew his station. Every man knew where he was to fit into this gigantic pattern. Daily, they boarded their ships. For all they knew, they were bound for France or Belgium or wherever their commanders have decided to strike. Every jeep, every tank, every piece of mobile equipment was assigned its place in the grand strategy of attack. In May of 1944, the air attacks were stepped up. Low-level bombing was carried out that included railroads, enemy headquarters, radar and communication systems, bridges and ammunition and supply dumps. The Allies also stepped up their battle with the Nazis in Italy to deceive Hitler. At the end of May, hardly a bridge remained intact in France. In England, the rehearsal was complete and the men were all briefed. The Allies were prepared for battle. The landing was planned for June 5th. The tides would be right on that day for the landing. Equipment and supplies were loaded. Then the men, 50 divisions, were in England, and 8 were picked to begin the landing. On June 3rd, the Armada was ready, but on the 4th, the weather report was unfavorable. A heavy storm was brewing, which would make the landing hazardous and the air support impossible. The heaving seas would make the Navy gunfire erratic. Eisenhower agreed to a 24-hour postponement. Any longer than that would mean that they would have to wait until the 20th for the tide to be favorable again. As the storm pounded through the channel, the forecasters predicted a break in the morning of the 6th. So on the 5th day of June, 1944, a fleet of more than 4,000 ships put out from England. This was D-Day. Paratroopers landed in Normandy behind the coastal defenses. Landings made with timing and precision, perfected through scores of rehearsals. Barges approached shore, ready for instant action. The armies of the United Nations have finally made their first landing on the soil of Western Europe. Another of the great decisive battles of world history has begun. This is the day that free people have waited for. D-Day. The Atlantic Wall has been penetrated. After the first assault, the Allies clung on precariously to a few beaches. But now they are getting a foothold on the fortress of Europe. Men and equipment have poured on the beaches with every favorable tide and had to land on some with unfavorable tides. The tremendous offensive was bitterly contested. The Nazis knew that each passing hour diminished their chances of throwing the Allies back into the sea. The American, British, and Canadian troops pressed forward firmly onto the soil of France and made contact with the French people. It was no pushover, driving the Germans back. Some Allied soldiers dropped within yards of the water's edge. There were two enemies, the Germans and the heavy seas. German prisoners were taken almost at once. American and British aircraft supported the landing magnificently, preventing the Germans from marshaling reinforcements. American bombers blasted peaceful-looking forests, the hiding of Nazi tank formations and dumps of high explosives. With beaches free of enemy fire, the Allies brought the heavy equipment ashore. Lumbering bulldozers set about to clear the way for vital air landing strips. The Allied shells blasted the German defenses and many German defenders. Survivors were given quick medical attention by the medical corps. Some were grateful, but many were bewildered by the smashing Allied attack. Doughboys and Tommies pushed forward yard by yard through the fields and into the villages and small towns. And more Nazi prisoners fell into their hands. Some were still arrogant and were reluctant to raise their hands. Landing crafts carried the prisoners back to England. They are now the defeated ones, and they will be behind barbed wire. Hitler did not strike back quickly, and this allowed the Allies to take a strong hold in the first weeks following D-Day. American, Canadian, and British soldiers fought their way through the countryside and villages of Normandy. On June 26th, American forces under General Omar Bradley captured Cherbourg. 8 days later, American soldiers were in Normandy. Joined by their new French friends, they celebrated the successes of the invasion's crucial first month. The great American victory of Cherbourg was officially announced. Coordinated British activity in the southeast made possible the rapid drive into the vital deep water port by troops of the United States. Crammed into the city were the elements of 3 German divisions. They were ordered to fight to the last man, to hold their positions or be shot by their own officers. But the impetus and firepower of the Allied offensive was too much for the worn defenders. Cherbourg was at last a liberated city. Allied machines of war had to be brought ashore on the beaches. This situation was now remedied by the capture of Cherbourg Harbor. The battle-scarred landscape is the price of liberation from Nazi tyranny. A powerful punch is added to the ground strapping by the new rocket-firing Typhoons. Their deadly missiles have proven even more effective than dive bombing. The flames propelled their charge at terrific speeds. The rocket itself has much greater weight and penetrating power than any shell that was ever fired by fighter planes. An automatic camera records the deadly results of the new flying artillery, a brand new kind of aerial warfare. Factories, marshalling yards, and ferries across the River Seine provide excellent targets. Mitchell bombers also attack railroad centers. The Nazis were left with few facilities to reinforce their Normandy armies. The armed might of America kept marching on. The forces created since the attack on Pearl Harbor represented a fighting machine that the Germans could not resist. Through the rubble of the battlefield, they drove their victory at Cherbourg. They have laid a battle of conquest that no army could destroy. The Allied confidence was up. They knew they had Hitler on the run. 32,000 Nazi prisoners had been taken in the Normandy campaign. The parade of beaten men was just the beginning, the gathering cavalcade of defeat for Nazi Germany.
On July 3rd, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Invasion Commander, once more visits American troops in Normandy. With Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, United States Ground Commander, and Major Witch of the 79th Division, he tours units and division commands. Eisenhower journeys to talk with Major General Lightning Joe Collins on the outskirts of Cherbourg. Next day, shells are stacked high. At exactly noon, in observance of July 4th, America's Independence Day, every United States gun in Normandy will send a shell crashing into the enemy. General Bradley will fire one of the long toms. In the French town of Grand-Camp-les-Bains, liberated Frenchmen join in celebrating America's Day of Independence. The Stars and Stripes and the French tricolor go up side by side. Trained by their schoolmaster, the children of the village join in singing America.
The soldiers owed a lot to the inventors of tanks that could go along the ground and discharge the mines. They also owed a lot to the designers of the Allied planes, such as the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. These planes gave a tremendous support to the men on the ground.
America's newest fighter plane, the P-47 Thunderbolt, has left the drafting boards and is now in mass production. A four-blade propeller absorbs the terrific power of its motor. Thousands of rounds of ammunition are stored in its wings. Guns are tested on the ground. The test pilot climbs aboard, fits his oxygen mask, and he's ready for a flight. Wheels begin to fold almost before they leave the runway. Like flying bullets, they speak across the sky. Thunderbolts in name, they pack thunderbolts of firepower.
The arsenal that is Britain. These are some of the fighter pilots engaged in the greatest air battles the world has ever known. With shells and bullets, they are rewriting Hitler's history in the skies above Nazi Europe. Pilots of the U.S. 8th Air Force Fighter Command, they carry the sky war to the enemy by daylight. The thunder of thunderbolts carry them to battle. Theirs is a long-range mission. The extra belly tanks of fuel will carry them to the heart of Germany's war effort. Rendezvous in the clouds. Above the continent, they overtake American bombers and escort them to the target. The air offensive that is now reaching the Nazi war capital itself. Maneuvering at top speed, they engage the enemy's interceptors. Cameras synchronized to operate with the guns produce unparalleled battle films, unquestionable evidence of the toll American sky fighters are exacting from Goering's Air Force. As the bombers weave through anti-aircraft fire, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, Mustangs go after the enemy with all guns blazing. In desperation, Nazi fighters swarm up to protect their war plants. This is all a part of Allied strategy, to draw the enemy fighters aloft and destroy them one by one. These pictures show vividly German losses mounting day after day. The American fighter squadron wings its way back to Britain, having struck another blow in the Allied campaign to win complete mastery of the air. Every Nazi emblem indicates an enemy plane shot down in combat. These are some of the men who are fighting the greatest air battles in history, the men who are blasting the Nazis from the skies.
Finally, the German resistance was making a difference. They blocked the Allied advance. But the British attacked the Germans near Caen, and the Americans landed launches at Saint-Lô. Meanwhile, General George Patton broke through the western flank of the German line at Avranches, and the great Allied breakthrough in France was underway. At the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula, American tanks were advancing just as fast as they could move. Penetrating deep into enemy territory, they drove south from captured Braville, 135 kilometers south of Cherbourg. Thus, since D-Day, the Allies have occupied the whole of the Cherbourg Peninsula and expanded their beachhead farther east. Now there is elbow room to mass and move a superbly equipped army. Already, the forces were striking inland for the final crushing defeat of the Germans in the west and in the stiffly resisted British sector as well. Natural barriers and determined opposition were being overcome. But even at the height of battle, the Tommies were able to find rest and refreshments behind the lines. A relaxed soldier often got a front-line view of the ceaseless Allied air attacks. These planes made it impossible for the enemy to marshal reinforcements except under cover of darkness. By daylight, RAF heavies pounded the German Air Force equipment depot at Saint-Cyr, near Paris. The land and air cooperation was an old story of Allied strategy, but again, they would end up victorious. Within a few days of the breakthrough, the Allied armies spread out across the French countryside and moved west toward Brittany and east in the direction of Paris. 100,000 of Hitler's soldiers, under direct orders from Hitler himself not to retreat, surrendered on August 22nd near Falaise. The second landing of the Allies took place on the 15th of August, as the 7th Army under General Alexander Patch landed on the beaches of the French Riviera.
10 weeks after D-Day on the beaches of Normandy, with the Wehrmacht reeling back from swift Allied blows that struck in all directions in western France, a mighty new force, poised for a landing in southern France, assembles in the Mediterranean. Here at Naples, part of the vast armada of 1,000 warships, transports, and landing craft of all kinds is made ready. Massed for loading are thousands of trucks, tanks, mobile cannon, military vehicles, and equipment, stretching acre upon acre in the embarkation area. Troops move up to their ships under Mediterranean Commander Sir Henry Maitland Wilson and Expeditionary Leader Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. American, French, British, Greek, and Polish forces take part. The convoy is underway. Aboard the flagship is Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, accompanied by General Patch, French Admiral Lemonnier, and United States Vice Admiral Hewitt, Chief of the Invasion Fleet. The Allies plan to strike along 100 miles of the French coast, to cut off the great ports of Marseille and Toulon, and to join with Eisenhower's forces from the north. In the air, spearheading the operations, hundreds of transports carry paratroop forces, ready to drop from the sky to secure road junctions and bridges behind the Riviera beachheads. Inside the planes, it's time to get ready. Down come the paratroops. The skies blossom with hundreds of chutes. Previously, 14,000 Allied airmen in 4,000 individual flights in a single day had helped clear the way for attack. Gliders have landed too, and the airborne troops now join together on the ground. Near the town of Lemuy, the paratroops move up to seize their objective. Bypassing German defenses, they have landed atop steep cliffs outside the town and start the descent to surprise the enemy from the rear, while simultaneously offshore, the Navy opens up. German shore batteries answer. While shell fire continues, the troops hit the beach. Immediately after landing, advance groups push inland, striking through the valleys and foothills of the Maritime Alps and fanning out east and west. 2 days' objectives are taken on the first day. In less than 3 days, this southern part of the French front is well established. Grenade rifles in action. Tanks blast a pillbox. The Nazi gun crew surrenders. Men of the FFI, French Forces of the Interior, make contact with the Allies in growing numbers. Citizens of the town of Fréjus come out to welcome the forces of liberation. Scores of towns and cities whose German garrisons have faced the double sword of fighting French resistance and oncoming Allied arms have now fallen. The Allies round out their master plan for the liberation of France and the crushing of the German enemy in the West.
The French resistance helped the American and Free French steadily advance from the south. French units attached to the U.S. 7th Army hooked up with General Patton's 3rd Army at the head of the Seine. The last of Hitler's mighty army in France didn't surrender till May of 1945. But with the Allies at the Rhine by early December of 1944, the battle for France was won. The Normandy landing would go into the history books forever, for it was one of the most important battles fought in Europe in World War II. It was the beginning of the end of Adolf Hitler and freedom and democracy to the populations of the West. It was D-Day.
It is not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
Winston Churchill was truly a Renaissance man. He was a journalist, historian, political leader, and painter. He was the personification of tenacity. Churchill continually managed to regain his position after enduring numerous political defeats. This intimate portrait of Winston Churchill allows us to better understand one of the great individuals of the 20th century.
You do your worst, and we will do our best.
Winston Spencer Churchill arrived in the world in the early morning hours of November 30th, 1874. His parents were vacationing in Blenheim Place. His parents were Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill. Randolph was the youngest son of the Duke of Marlborough and a member of the upper crust of British society. Lady Randolph was the former Jeannie Jerome of New York, whose father was a stockbroker. She was part of the high society of New York. She spent her teenage years in Europe. Jeannie and her family moved to England, and it was at a ball given by the Prince of Wales where the two met. Within 3 days of the party, they were engaged. Randolph's family was adamantly opposed to the marriage, partially because she was an American and partially because they felt that the young couple didn't know each other well enough to make a lifelong decision. They convinced Randolph and Jeannie to wait 1 year until the parliamentary elections. Randolph was running for election. Immediately after the elections of February 1874, while basking in the victory of Randolph's election, the couple formally announced their engagement and wed the following April in Paris. Winston was born approximately 7.5 months after the marriage. His mother loved the social scene and never missed an opportunity for fun. She was riding a horse during a shooting party, and she fell off and began going into labor. Jeannie did not have a strong commitment to motherhood, and once she was physically able, she left young Winston with his nanny and rejoined the social whirlwind of London. Mrs. Everest was the stable force in his upbringing, and she and Winston were close until her death. The year after Winston's birth, Randolph managed to alienate Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales by taking sides in a friend's divorce case. They were no longer considered welcome guests by the royal family. To regain favor, the Duke of Marlborough became the Viceroy of Ireland, a position that he retained for 5 years. Randolph joined his father as his secretary. His parents spent very little time with Winston, and to make matters worse, they had a second son, and Winston became more withdrawn. The Churchills returned to England. Randolph was re-elected to Parliament as part of the minority party. He was involved in his career, and Jeannie in maintaining their position in society, and parenting had been relegated to his grandparents and his nanny. Shortly before his birthday, his mother escorted him to Ascot, where he was enrolled in St. George's School. Winston had a difficult time acclimating to structured school life and ended up seeing the headmaster on a weekly basis for discipline. He was a poor student, and after 2 years, his nanny discovered welts where he had been beaten. Winston was taken out of St. George's, and he was enrolled in a new school in Brighton, where he did very well academically. During this time in school, he wrote pleading letters to both his mother and father, asking them to write. Randolph was campaigning near Winston's school and wouldn't even take the time to visit his son. Randolph was attempting to make a name for himself. He became leader of the House of Commons and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Unfortunately, his career was short-lived, for he would not support the Prime Minister's budgetary recommendation, and Randolph was forced to resign. His life took on a downward spiral, and his political career came to a halt. His health began to decline, for he had contracted syphilis. Winston now attended Harrow, where he once again had academic problems, and Randolph had him transferred from an academic emphasis to a military emphasis. Although Winston was more successful, he still had difficulties because all the years when he did not pursue his studies had finally caught up with him. He failed the entrance exams for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He was tutored and finally accepted after his third attempt, but to the infantry instead of the cavalry because his grades were not high enough. Winston was successful, but he realized that he did not want to be part of the infantry. He wanted to be a member of the 4th Hussars, a cavalry regiment where he had many friends. Winston maneuvered his way in and about the time his father passed away from ravages of syphilis. The family was deep in debt, and both Winston and his mother spent money like there was no tomorrow. In September 1896, Winston and the Hussars left England for Bombay, where they were to be posted for the next 12 years. Winston was stationed in Bangalore, about 600 miles south of Bombay. He was lucky enough to get a 3-month leave to England at the beginning of his 9th month in India. He was determined to begin networking his way into developing a political foundation for himself. He made his first political speech on July 26, 1897. His leave had to be shortened when a revolt of the Pathan tribesmen of the borders of India and Afghanistan developed. He was given the assignment of correspondent and began publishing articles about the fighting. Winston spent a great deal more time making a name for himself instead of being an active member of the Hussars. He now wanted to be posted to General Horatio Kitchener in Egypt. Kitchener did not want to take Winston because he felt he was not committed to a military life. It took a letter from the Prime Minister to get Winston in, but Winston had to agree not to collect a pension if he got wounded in battle. Winston was involved in one battle during the uprising, which left 428 wounded and 48 dead. After the war, he wrote the bestseller, The River War, and resigned his commission in March of 1899. Once back in England, he focused all his attention on his political career and became a candidate for a seat in the House of Commons. Winston wanted to follow his father's path. He always wanted his father's support and approval and felt shortchanged that his father died before he could see that Winston amounted to something, and this fueled Winston's desire to make a name for himself next to his father. Churchill was defeated, but he viewed this only as a minor setback. The Boer War was in full swing in 1899. The Dutch Boers were fighting with the British in the Transvaal Republic. Britain had annexed the Republic more than 20 years before, but the Dutch had begun denying rights to the British settlers in South Africa. British troops were sent to protect the settlers. The Boers were very well organized and had a large arsenal of weapons. Winston was sent by the Morning Post to cover the story. His steamer landed in Cape Town, and he went directly to Durban, where the fighting had erupted. Churchill was on his first assignment when he became a prisoner of war. Winston debated whether or not to go on a rail patrol because he was afraid that he might miss a bigger story elsewhere. This trip turned out to be one of the most influential days of Winston's life. He was traveling on a train that had been derailed by the Boers. The British soldiers were captured along with Winston, and they were sent to a makeshift prison in Pretoria. Churchill had appealed to the Boers to be released because he was a journalist. They refused. He was held prisoner for 3 weeks when he escaped through a lavatory window. He was viewed as a hero by the British press. Wanted posters offered a 25-pound reward, dead or alive. 25 years old, about 5 feet 8, walks with a slight stoop, pale appearance, red-brown hair, almost invisible small mustache, speaks through his nose, cannot pronounce the letters, cannot speak Dutch, has last been seen in a brown suit of clothes. Winston jumped a train and later hid in a mine surrounded by Boer forces. He once again fled by train and arrived in Durban. He wrote an article and book about his escapades. He told his readers, "I hated every minute of my captivity more than I have hated any other period in my whole life." Great events were in progress, fine opportunities for action and adventure were slipping away. Back in England, he ran for Parliament in Oldham and won by a narrow victory. His mother was actively involved in his campaign. He was showcased by the Tory party, but after a short time, Winston found himself at odds with the party. He had different views about trade and generally had more liberal and progressive ideas. He changed to the Liberal Party. Winston wanted to be part of the winning ticket and joined the Liberal bandwagon. In 1905, he was offered a junior cabinet position. Initially, he turned down the party leadership and set his sights on the post of Undersecretary for the Colonies. He later described this assignment in calculated fashion, not one of any great responsibility, but an excellent arena to showcase himself in the House of Commons. Winston was far from popular with his colleagues. His boldness and self-perpetuation alienated many. In 1908, he was appointed president of the Board of Trade. He was 33 and the youngest cabinet member. Within a few months, Winston had many ideas for streamlining expenses, such as buying less weapons and using the savings for social programs. He was viewed as a social reformer. He was responsible for establishing the minimum wage and mandatory lunch and tea breaks. Winston Churchill was firmly established as a successful politician. Once again, he wished his father had witnessed his success, but his goal was to continue where his father had left off. Winston was pleased with his professional life, but felt his personal life was lacking. He felt he needed a companion, a wife. He had a lonely youth and wanted to share his life with someone. He wasn't the most handsome of individuals, but he finally met his match in March 1908, when he found himself seated next to Clementine Hozier at a dinner party. Their first meeting occurred 4 years earlier, and Clementine had spent the evening avoiding him. Winston was determined to win her over. She was extremely popular and beautiful. Winston proposed 6 months after their meeting. They were married on September the 12th, 1908. She was 23 and he was 33. It proved to be a very happy marriage, although the new Mrs. Churchill had a difficult time adjusting to not only her role as a political wife, but getting used to the somewhat overpowering Winston. Churchill had to deal with many political problems during his tenure. There was a massive rail strike in which he was forced to use troops. He lost the support of the trade and labor unions. called Iraq. The British government did not share his concerns, and the cabinet prepared to assist India in the transition. In Parliament, Churchill openly opposed any discussion of self-rule. He continued to shock the British by supporting the neutral position of Britain in the Spanish Civil War, and he felt that King Edward VIII need not abdicate to Mary, but that the government needed to be more tolerant. His collision course found him with few friends, and he was disregarded by his party. Churchill had spoke since 1932 about the threat of Germany, but he was ignored. Winston had secret contact in the Foreign Office that provided him with confidential information regarding Hitler. He felt strongly that Nazism was the greatest danger and emergency in our history. In his speech, Britain Must Arm, America Must Arm, broadcast in the United States on October 16, 1938, Churchill championed the need of re-establishing the Ministry of Munitions. Britain was
to form an administration. The great
German forces were making It was Churchill's leadership that provided the people with the reassurance On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. Within a week, an armistice between France and Germany was agreed upon.
So I'm happy to inform the House that our fighter strength is stronger at the present time relatively to the Germans, who have suffered terrible losses, than it has ever been. And consequently, we believe ourselves possessed of the capacity to continue the war in the air under better conditions than we have ever experienced before. I look forward confidently to the exploits of our fighter pilots, these splendid men, this brilliant youth, who will have the glory of saving their native land, their island home, and all they love from the most deadly of all attacks. There remains, of course, the danger of bombing attacks, which will certainly be made very soon upon us by the bomber forces of the enemy. It is true that the German bomber force is superior in numbers to ours, but we have a very large bomber force also, which we shall use to strike at military targets in Germany without intermission. I do not at all underrate the severity of the ordeal which lies before us, but I believe our countrymen will show themselves capable of standing up to it, like the brave men of Barcelona, and will be able to stand up to it and carry on in spite of it, at least as well as any other people in the world. Much will depend upon this. Every man and every woman will have the chance to show the finest qualities of their race and render the highest service to their cause. I have thought it right upon this occasion to give the House and the country some indication of the solid, practical grounds upon which we base our inflexible resolve to continue the war. There are a good many people who say, never mind, win or lose, sink or swim, better die than submit to tyranny, and such a tyranny. And I do not dissociate myself from them. But I can assure them that our professional advisors of the three services unitedly advise that we should carry on the war, and that there are good and reasonable hopes of final victory. We have fully informed and consulted all the self-governing dominions. These great communities, far beyond the oceans, who have been built up on our laws and on our civilization, and who are absolutely free to choose their course, but are absolutely devoted to the ancient motherland, and who feel themselves inspired by the same emotions which lead me to stake our all upon duty and honor. During the first 4 years of the last war, Mr. Speaker, the Allies experienced nothing but disaster and disappointment. That was our constant fate. One blow after another, terrible losses, frightful dangers. Everything miscarried. And yet at the end of those 4 years, the morale of the Allies was higher than that of the Germans, who had moved from one aggressive triumph to another, and who stood everywhere triumphant invaders of the lands into which they had broken. During that war, we repeatedly asked ourselves the question, how are we going to win? And no one was able ever to answer it with much precision, until at the end, quite suddenly, quite unexpectedly, our terrible foe collapsed before us, and we were so glutted with victory that in our folly we threw it away.
After the defeat of France,
Meaning over the tide, on we and quickly attain us. It is true
Suitable. And the need to uh, like no indignant to broader lands and better days.
This blitzkrieg
some neck.
He received a hero's welcome. Unfortunately, Churchill was not experiencing a great deal of public support in Britain. British losses at sea were high. Britain had lost half its convoys to German U-boats. In North Africa, British troops were retreating, and it was a great blow to the morale of the troops when Singapore surrendered to the Japanese in February 1942. 62,000 troops were taken prisoner. The people had begun to doubt Churchill's ability, and a vote of censure was taken in the House of Commons. Churchill won by a large margin, but Britain needed a large victory. Russia was being overtaken by the Germans. There were large numbers of casualties, and Nazi troops were only miles away from Moscow. They were defeated and run out of North Africa. In Tunis, German prisoners of war were paraded in front of cheering crowds. The war effort was all-consuming for Churchill. He realized early on that much of the domestic duties and decisions would have to be delegated. The Grand Coalition was established. It was comprised of conservatives, liberal, labor, and the king. It was led by Deputy Prime Minister Clement Attlee, his one-time rival for Prime Minister. Attlee did an excellent job of running the country, especially in the fact that Churchill was gone a great deal of the time. In May of 1943, Churchill went back to the United States. He was anxious to get a commitment from America as to an invasion of Europe, and Roosevelt wanted to make sure that Britain would take part in defeating Japan. It was Churchill's third visit in 18 months. Roosevelt agreed to American troops for a cross-channel invasion in 1944. Secretly, an atomic bomb was being developed. they would be victorious over Germany. Shortly after the defeat of the Germans, Labour called for new elections. The war with Japan still lingered on. The British people overwhelmingly were pleased with Churchill's leadership during the war, but they did not see him as the best choice to lead Britain during its reconstructive efforts. Winston resigned as Prime Minister on May 23rd. The King asked him to run the caretaker government until elections could be held. It was a difficult campaign for Winston. He attacked the Labour Party position. He made a speech that would dog him for the rest of the campaign. Winston made the comparison that a Labour government would become a socialist government. He claimed that they would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. Churchill's wife, Clementine, had asked him to delete that portion of the speech. He refused. The speech had a very negative impact on Churchill's campaign. It was decided that the election would be held on July the 5th. It would take approximately 3 weeks to determine the outcome because they had to wait for the returns from the servicemen abroad. Churchill cast his vote and then left for Potsdam. This was the first meeting of the Big Three. Harry S. Truman was the new President of the United States. This historic conference shaped the boundaries of the post-war world. Once again, Churchill brought up the problem of Poland, but Truman was unwilling to take a position. Truman disclosed at the meeting that the atomic bomb had been tested in New Mexico. Churchill gave his consent if the United States wanted to use the bomb against the Japanese. Churchill left Potsdam on July 25th before the conference ended to be in England for the election results. Winston was stunned by the defeat. He resigned the same night as the returns. He was very hurt that the people he had worked relentlessly for had discarded him. Winston left for an extended vacation in Italy, where he swam and painted. He once said of painting, "Painting is a companion with whom one may hope to walk a great part of life's journeys. Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely." Once back in England, he led many of the discussions of the opposition. He continued to speak of the threat of the Soviet Union. In March of 1946, Churchill was invited by Truman to speak at Fulton College regarding the Iron Curtain. He spoke of a united Europe and the threat of a Cold War. He wanted the United Nations to act as peacekeepers. There was a great deal of negative response to his speech. People were not ready to engage in new conflicts. Winston spoke to European audiences about building a united Europe so that people are able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. These speeches laid the foundation for the United States Marshall Plan. Churchill was by no means idle. He painted, he wrote articles, and began writing the Second World War, for which he would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was also the opposition leader for the Conservative Party. As conservatives won more elections, they finally became the party in power, and in 1951, Churchill became Prime Minister once again. He was close to 80, and Clementine felt that the position would be physically too taxing. Once again, he embraced the duties of Prime Minister. In 1953, he went to the United States to visit President Eisenhower. There were many obvious differences between the two tenures as Prime Minister. He delegated a great deal and could no longer keep the long hours he had in the past. He had abused his health for so many years that it was no real surprise that in June of 1953, Winston suffered a stroke. It was kept from the public. The doctors waited to see if he would regain his speech and be able to walk. It took a few months, but he did almost totally recover. He was able to give a major speech at a Conservative Party conference in October without the audience detecting a difference. Also in '53, he received the Order of the Garter as well as the Nobel Prize in Literature. Churchill was honored on his 80th birthday with a portrait presented to him at Parliament. It was an extremely unflattering portrait that Clementine destroyed before her death.
The portrait is a remarkable example of modern art.
It became more apparent that he was too weak to maintain the demands of being Prime Minister, and on April 5, 1955, he resigned. Once again, he battled his depression. Winston referred to this as his black dog. He retreated to the south of France to paint and to be with friends. It became almost a second home. He did retain his seat in Parliament until 1964, when at the age of 89, he resigned. He visited Parliament for the last time in July of 1964. He was recognized with the commendation that states the people's unbounded admiration and gratitude for his service to Parliament, to the nation, and to the world. His health continued to decline, and on January 24th, 1965, he died from a massive stroke. On the floor at Westminster Abbey, a marble stone is inscribed with the simple request, "Remember Winston Churchill."